Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are returning to September 2007 and taking a look at the highly requested D-Rada deck, or the Perfect Circle deck that wasn't like Jonathan LeBounty's at the first SJC of the format, but the one that included Light and Darkness Dragon. So technically you wouldn't be able to play this deck immediately in September of 2007. The cards such as Foolish Burial, Marshmallow, and then more specifically Light and Darkness Dragon wouldn't be released until November heading into December. So the very first SJC where you would have been able to use these cards would have been San Mateo in December 2007. I always refer to a format in terms of the date in which it started, unless it's Edison, which is kind of a special case. As a result, I'm going to label this September 2007, but if you actually played some of those early events, as we've actually already profiled, you wouldn't see exactly this deck list. This would appear a little bit further on into the format. And as I just mentioned, there are significant card releases that to me require us to look at two separate decks. We've looked at Jonathan LeBounty's Perfect Circle deck already. We talked about it combating against Comic Odyssey Burn, which we've profiled, Card of Safe Return Zombie. We've already sort of profiled those decks. The D-Raida deck that we're going to talk about today is a little bit different because Light and Darkness Dragon itself is going to require not only your deck to significantly change, but a lot of other decks to significantly change. In addition to the release of Light and Darkness Dragon, you also have the release of Foolish Burial and then Marshmallow. Three cards that are incorporated into today's deck list and were incorporated throughout many of the other decks at the time. What really differentiated this from earlier versions of Perfect Circle is that instead of running the two Zaborgs to complement three Rises, this deck is going to swap the Zaborgs for Light and Darkness Dragon. Light and Darkness Dragon is obviously an incredibly powerful card. I'll talk all about it when we get to the deck profile, but it's slotted in perfectly into this deck because it already could conduct a double tribute, right? It had Malicious, it had Brain Control, it decided in some cases to play Soul Exchange, which I think was a good idea. It had cards like Treeborn Frog, Call of the Haunted, Premature Burial. It had ways of putting two monsters on the field. In addition to that, it also had the best target for the recursion effect of Light and Darkness Dragon, which is by far Disc Commander. Other decks in later Yu-Gi-Oh! History, like Frog Monarchs, might revive a Monarch, which is fine, but it's not generating the amount of card advantage that recurring Disc Commander would. So in addition to being easily summoned in this particular deck, it also had the best recursion target, which was a natural inclusion in a Destiny Hero-based deck anyway, in Disc Commander. So it really put together a perfect shell. The D-Raida deck had a lot of success overseas in Japan before being brought over to the United States. That's actually where the nickname D-Raida comes from the Japanese name for Light and Darkness Dragon. So if you are curious, obviously the D stands for Destiny Hero, but where that Raida comes from is from the Japanese name of Light and Darkness Dragon. Had a ton of success in the OCG, came over to the TCG, it won San Mateo, it won the consecutive YCSs back-to-back, leading up to the release of Phantom Darkness when the format shifted quite dramatically. But for those couple YCSs or SJCs at the time, this was really the top-tier deck. Unfortunately for those that played it, though, the decks that countered it were also pretty popular, and if you were playing a mirror match, your matchup was going to be pretty tough. There was a Macrocosmos-based deck that really feasted on Destiny Hero-based decks. There was gadget decks that were really difficult because they could just jam so many trap cards. There were Comic Odyssey Burn decks, which can be a difficult matchup if you don't see your Wing Blasts. There was a variety of decks that did a good job of counteracting the D-Raida deck. As a result, as you'll see, we are overly siding for those matchups. We are basically foregoing siding anything in the mirror match because I just don't think it's really necessary, and jamming almost entirely for those really difficult matchups, which made this a pretty difficult deck because game one, the engine is so strong, and if two players are playing a mirror match, it's usually a pretty enjoyable match. Then in game 2 and 3, if you do happen to play against some of these anti-Destiny Hero strategies like Macro, you have a lot of good cards to the side deck. Dust Tornado, Mobius, Royal Decree, etc. Which made this a pretty resilient deck in games 2 and 3, although in game 1, cards like Macro and D-Fisher could absolutely be the end of you. One other thing to note, as I've alluded to, I've always started formats in September or March or April, depending on when the ban list occurred. This deck wasn't legal until around November into December. Technically, at the very end of this format, Phantom Darkness was released, which means Dark Arm Dragon was released, and Allure, and a massive shift in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card pool occurred and in the decks. So D-Raida decks, although fairly iconic in the memory of a lot of players, was actually only a couple month period of time before Destiny Heroes were swapped into Dark Arm Dragon decks, and Light and Darkness Dragon became more of sort of a tech card that you might occasionally see here or there. So iconic, memorable deck, a deck that a lot of people really enjoy, and when they say Perfect Circle, to some people that means with Zaborgs. That's typically what I think. Others, though, think of Light and Darkness Dragon, and although it was a short-lived period of time where this was a top-tier deck, it is still a deck that has been highly requested in the comments. So without further ado, we are going to take a look at a D-Raida deck Destiny heroes that are going to incorporate Perfect Circle, specifically legal in and around the time period before the release of Phantom Darkness. I will also note I am going to include the prize cards, Gold Sarcophagus, and Crush Card Virus. If you feel like it is unnecessary to include such expensive cards and you want to go back and play this format, I will give some recommendations as to what you could include instead. But we are going to look at this deck at its absolute ceiling, which is, to me, with both of those, pretty lethal prize cards. Without further ado, let's take our very first deep dive look at D-Rada. All right, first we'll start with the Monarchs, which is really just 3 copies of Ryza. As I commented on in the introduction, we are cutting back on things like the Stalos and Zaborg and instead playing a different tribute monster. But we are still going to keep the 3 copies of Ryza. Ryza is the best Monarch at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, combines perfectly with Wing Blast. In addition to that, it gives us main deck outs to cards like Macrocosmos, D-Fissure, and even if you're not necessarily targeting those continuous cards, potentially your opponent might have 2 of them, you could be picking off their other back rows and then maybe just trying to beat down and ignoring the fact that they have a card like Dimension Fissure or Macrocosmos on the field. But either way, we have 3 copies of Ryza. This was universal. Even if you kept playing Perfect Circle and you didn't include the Light and Darkness Dragons, you'd still be running 3 copies of Ryza. It was easily the best Monarch, and regardless if you're playing this deck or a dedicated Monarch deck, or honestly even a Monarch-based Macrocosmos DD Survivor-based deck, all of those are still going to include Ryza because it's just simply the best. Then we have the new inclusion. This is the card that really differentiates this deck from the Jonathan LaBounty Perfect Circle decks that we previously profiled, which is Light and Darkness Dragon. This new release slotted in perfectly into the Perfect Circle shell that we talked about earlier. And it was for a lot of different reasons. One, this deck can pretty reliably get 2 monsters in order to conduct a tribute summon. That's Malicious and Treeborn Frog often contributing, but even cards like Brain Control and Soul Exchange, Premature Burial, Call of the Haunted are all ways that the board can get clogged up really easily, and you can double tribute for Light and Darkness Dragon, so it really fits that part really well. In addition to that, this deck had the best target to revive off Light and Darkness Dragon's second effect, which is Disc Commander. As many times as you can revive Disc Commander, the better. Those 2 draws end up fueling future Light and Darkness Dragons or just continually gain you card advantage throughout the game. So the fact that this deck not only could reliably tribute summon for 2, it also had the best revival targets. And if you happen to not have access to Disc Commander, Sangin, Card Trooper, Stratos, those are all pretty reasonable monsters to special summon, even something like Ryza, to be brutally honest. So this deck across the board had the best targets to revive off Light and Darkness Dragon, and it was probably the easiest deck to actually summon Light and Darkness Dragon in. Maybe there are some other of the Monarch decks that had a lot of soul exchanges, but at that point you're not reviving things like Disc Commander, so it's not as valuable. So double Light and Darkness Dragon. In many ways, you could have replaced the 2 Zaborgs from Jonathan LaBounty's deck that we previously profiled and replaced them with 2 Light and Darkness Dragons, and then it still has that shell of 5 pretty strong tribute monsters. Players that elected to go against the grain and not play Light and Darkness Dragon usually had Zaborg in this slot. So 5 big tribute monsters. Technically, Malicious is a tribute monster, but we really never want to tribute it. But we have 2 copies of Malicious. It was semi-limited to 2, but we are obviously still going to run it. Then for the remaining Destiny heroes, we have 1 copy of Fearmonger and 1 copy of Disc Commander. You could bump up the Fearmonger to 2. You could even include a card like Plasma. There was a version of this deck where you had more copies of Light and Darkness Dragon and more copies of Plasma, and then you could actually play Trade-In, which was a new release during this time period too. It wasn't the standard version of D-Rada based decks, but it was one of the versions that was out there. I like the smaller Destiny Hero count just because I don't want to have multiple dead Fearmongers. In this particular format, a lot of the anti-meta decks like Macro and D-Fissure are really tough to beat in game 1 anyway, so I think it's better to include a card that I'm going to show you in a few moments instead of the second Fearmonger. Your potential access to Crush Card Virus, though, might shift your decision on that. Obviously, if you have access to Crush Card, having more Fearmongers is probably a better decision because then obviously you have more targets for Crush Card, but I don't think that was much of an issue. Between these 4, Spirit Reaper, Sangin, I felt like Crush Card targets were plenty, so even just having 1 copy is perfectly fine to me. You can sort of make that decision. One of the things that bumping up Fearmonger would allow you to do is bump up your quantity of Destiny draws. Is you're going to see I'm only going to include 2 Destiny draws, which is a little bit awkward in the sense that most of the time when you think of D-Hero formats, you think of just the full play set of 3 D-Draws. I'm not going to do that in my spell lineup. So if you really have an affinity for triple D-Draw, you probably could bump up Fearmonger or include Plasma and shift around some of the other card choices. But that is our small D-Hero package, of course, with the 1 copy of Stratos to sort them out. The monster that I was alluding to a few moments ago that I think is better than the second copy of Fearmonger and thus only running 2 Destiny draws is Gravekeeper Spy. This was not standard, but it was something that I recall doing, and it is something that Cedric Sequeira did, in the final Shonen Jump of this particular format, or at least when this particular deck was legal. Spy is pretty useful to me because, one, it's 2 monsters on the field for Light and Darkness Dragon, so it instantly, builds the field for that. It's obviously good tribute fodder for Ryza. That interaction has always existed, where Spy's big defense and the fact that it summons a second one pretty reliably sets you up for a Monarch. But it did a really good job against all of your most difficult matchups. I'm talking about the Gadget deck. I'm talking about the Macrocosmos-based decks. Those can be really difficult matchups, and Spy is a perfect card against them because it doesn't matter if your opponent has Macro, it doesn't matter if they have D-Fissure. Spy is going to reliably brick wall them because depending on their build, they might be limited to cards like DD Survivor and Banisher with Radiance, and then even sometimes an Elemental Hero Wildheart / Stratos package. And having to deal with 2,000 defense monsters can be pretty tough unless they themselves are running Monarchs, which wasn't always the case. If they have to use Exile Force on a Spy and then they have to deal with another Spy, you feel like you're in pretty good shape. Plus, Gravekeeper Spy is one of the most reliable ways of keeping a monster on field so that you can tribute for Ryza and potentially spin one of their Macro or D-Fissure to the top of their deck, setting them back a draw, and then maybe even opening yourself up to accessing your graveyard. So I really loved Spy. I thought it slotted in just perfectly in this deck because it's totally fine in mirror matches. 2,000 defense is nothing to laugh at. It fuels Light and Darkness Dragon, and it gives you some resistance against the most difficult matchups, which are all those trap-based, stun-based, D-Fissure-based decks. So 2 Spies I thought was a fantastic inclusion. I remember doing that back in the day. And if you're going to cut the Fearmonger, I think Spy is a perfect swap. Then we have 2 copies of DD Crow. This was a concession for how many mirror matches that you were likely to play. The format was relatively diverse, but the mirror match was definitely the boogeyman in the room. Double DD Crow allows you to banish the Disc Commander and make it so they can't recur it off Call of the Haunted, Premature Burial, of course, Light and Darkness Dragon. You can hit Treeborn Frog, you can hit the Malicious when it's discarded off Destiny Draw or a Snipe Hunter or Wing Blast. It obviously has a lot of applications there. It fizzles Pot of Avarice, so it really slotted in fairly well against those matchups. Obviously, it is a horrible card against things like Macrocosmos-based decks, but a little bit of a concession, right? We are hedging a little bit towards all of the matchups in the main deck. Next, we have value monsters. I call them value monsters because they're great with Call of the Haunted, they're great with Premature Burial, especially when you chain Call of the Haunted to something like Heavy Storm. But they're also reasonable monsters to summon off Light and Darkness Dragon. And if you're summoning Malicious and Spy, it clogs the field a little bit. Maybe it fuels a Monarch on the next turn, but that's not that great. At least a card like Sangin and Card Trooper can recur, whether it's through a search or through a draw. A little bit of hand advantage when Light and Darkness Dragon goes off if you don't happen to have Disc Commander. And then they both slot in perfectly well into this deck, both as a crush card target and then a card that can mill, whether it's Disc Commander, Malicious, or Treeborn Frog. Of course, we're going to play 1 copy of Treeborn Frog as well. Treeborn Frog was especially important in this format because it was a reliable way of draining Light and Darkness Dragon, both your own and your opponent's. During the standby phase, you can bring back, or attempt to bring back Treeborn Frog, and it will cause the negation effect on Light and Darkness Dragon, reducing it by 500 attack and defense. And then because it's still the standby phase, you can just simply bring back Treeborn Frog again and do the exact same thing, draining Light and Darkness Dragon all the way down and opening up your activations of monster effects and spells and traps and all those cards during your main phase 1, when their Light and Darkness Dragon can no longer negate. And if you yourself need to resolve something like Ryza, for example, you can do that exact same thing. Now, you could theoretically tribute the Light and Darkness Dragon for Ryza, but let's just say for the sake of discussion, you need to keep the Light and Darkness Dragon down with just a little bit of attack points and then tribute summon that Treeborn Frog for Ryza. Well, that's perfectly fine because you can drain your own Light and Darkness Dragon if you need. Same is true if you need to resolve a Pot of Avarice or whatever it happens to be. So Treeborn Frog not only fueled your tribute summon of Light and Darkness Dragon, your tribute summon of Ryza, gave you a good target for Foolish, gave you that chance of hitting it off Card Trooper. It also was a counter to Light and Darkness Dragon and a way to turn off your own Light and Darkness Dragon. So it was really pivotal. One of the main reasons why you might include DD Crow in your deck. Then we have the back row removal monsters. I hate Snipe Hunter. I would not include Snipe Hunter in basically any old retro deck. However, it was pretty common during this format. If you're going to go back and play this format, and you are going to be authentic to the time period, there is the reality that you're going to run into Skill Drain Burn decks, so you're going to run into Macrocosmos-based decks, or even Gadget decks that have a bunch of traps. And having a card that outs some of the floodgates isn't a bad idea. So there's Snipe Hunter. Breaker, I think, is just Snipe Hunter, but way better, right? It reliably destroys a back row. You don't have to discard. You don't have to risk missing. Yes, this deck has a couple good discard outlets in the double Malicious, to a certain extent, Disc Commander and Treeborn, but I think with Wing Blast, you have plenty of discard outlets. I really don't think it's necessary, but a lot of people were pretty big supporters of Snipe Hunter back in the day. And then we have 2 monsters that might seem a little bit odd, especially Marshmallow, right? This card doesn't generate any card advantage. It might seem out of place. Spirit Reaper, on the other hand, is a little bit more common back in the day, even if it might seem a little bit out of place, all things considered. These were considered outs to Light and Darkness Dragon, or at least cards that prolonged the game. What I mean by that is when Light and Darkness Dragon attacks into either of these, they're just going to sit there, right? Light and Darkness Dragon doesn't stop continuous effects. Both of these cannot be destroyed by battle. So if you're staring down to Light and Darkness Dragon and you set Reaper or Marshmallow, you'll eventually be able to draw your way out of it, whether that's drawing into Treeborn Frog or drawing into a way to conduct a chain link such that Light and Darkness Dragon is spun to the top of the opponent's deck with Wing Blast, or maybe you take it with enemy controller. So it gives you the time to eventually draw into an out. In retrospect, I don't think Marshmallow belongs in this deck at all. However, Spirit Reaper probably is still just fine. It's a crush card target. It's always been a pretty reasonable monster. It has a secondary effect of discarding cards from the opponent's hand that actually matters. 1,000 points of damage with Marshmallow just honestly doesn't matter. Life points are a resource, not something that you really need to attack directly in this capacity. So I think if you go back and play this format, you could very easily just cut Marshmallow, and I think it's totally reasonable. Though, to be authentic to the deck profiles at the time, it might seem odd to think of Marshmallow as a pseudo-staple, but it was very, very common in these particular decks. I will say it also gives you a little bit of resistance against some of the macro Cosmos-based decks. You know, if you can slow the game down, you could eventually draw into your main deck outs. Heavy Storm, MST, Wing Blast, Ryza, etc., Breaker. I think Spy does that in just a way better way, right? Because it's clogging the field, gives you outs to tribute summoning for Light and Darkness Dragon. So to me, I would consider a third Spy before the actual Marshmallow, but we haven't got to profile any decks with this card, and I think it's kind of interesting to note the fact that there was a time that it was a pretty common card in D-Hero-based Light and Darkness Dragon decks. Then for the spells, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there's only 2 copies of Destined Draw. You could play 3. You know, there have been times where this card was semi-limited, even limited, actually, if you look at Edison format. I've elected only to run 2 because I'm only running 1 Fearmonger. If you wanted to bump the Fearmonger or consider running Plasma and then incorporating Scapegoats, there are ways to get to 3, which if you go back and look at old deck profiles, plenty of people did. But I've elected only to put the 2 here because I feel like that's a little bit of a reasonable decision if I want to play Spy. It's hard to incorporate 3 D-Draws and Spy, but 2 D-Draws. We have 1 Pot of Avarice. You could bump this up to 2. You know, Labani's original Perfect Circle deck had 2 copies of Pot of Avarice. At that particular event, going all the way back to the Show and Jump in Washington, decks like Macro Cosmos were not nearly as popular, and main decking DD Crow is also not as popular. As you can see here with just the deck that we're profiling, main deck DD Crow became much more popular as a way of counteracting Fearmonger, reviving Disc Commander, or Light and Darkness Dragon, reviving Disc Commander. It really was a target for Disc Commander. Well, that also now means it's going to hit Pot of Avarice. So the likelihood of resolving Avarice dropped considerably. So I've elected only to run 1 copy here because 1, we could be playing against macro decks and never get to resolve this, or 2, we could be fueling our opponent's DD Crow. Then there's a bunch of 1-ups. We have MST and Heavy Storm, both limited to 1, but they are the primary back row destruction effects. We definitely need them in this particular format, for sure. We have 2 cards that allow us to conduct tribute summons, Brain Control, which has other flexibility, but Soul Exchange. Soul Exchange is a somewhat new inclusion, right? The older Perfect Circle decks wouldn't have used this because they're only tribute summoning for 1. And at that point, whether it's through Brain Control or just through the deck's natural cards like 1 Treeborn Frog, 1 Premature, 1 Malicious Effect, etc., you could conduct tribute summons for Monarchs. We're trying to tribute summon for Light and Darkness Dragon now, so being able to use a card like Soul Exchange in order to conduct that double tribute actually matters a little bit more. So Soul Exchange, a card that was not included in previous versions of this deck. 1 copy of Reinforcements of the Army, searches Stratos, searches Disc Commander, Fearmonger. 1 Premature Burial, obviously we're running Disc Commander. It was, I would say, exactly a staple at the time, but if you're running more of these traditional decks and not something like a macro beatdown deck, you would definitely include Premature, but even decks like Gadgets might cut this, right? If you're playing Disc Commander, it's a different story, but I could see you going back and cutting Premature, which a lot of people are doing now when they play some retro Yu-Gi-Oh formats like GOAT. We have 1 copy of Foolish Burial. This is a new release at the time. This is one of the cards that makes this deck different from the Perfect Circle deck we previously profiled. You could even increase the quantity of Foolish Burials to 2. Some people did that. There was actually a version of Green Baboon at the time that played 3 Foolish Burials, so you could totally manipulate how many Foolish Burials you elect to run. This deck really has 3 primary targets, right? We're sending Disc Commander in order to fuel Light and Darkness Dragon. We're sending Malicious so that we can conduct a Tribute Summon, kind of acting like a Fiend Sanctuary almost, where a 1 card puts a monster on the field for a Tribute Summon. Or we're sending Treeborn Frog to fuel future Tribute Summons or counteract / stop our own Light and Darkness Dragon. So we have 3 reasonable targets. If you think that warrants more copies of Foolish Burial, you are more than welcome to bump that up to 2. I wouldn't necessarily consider 3, but definitely 2. Some people are in 2. I've elected just to include 1. I think 1 is perfectly fine. Then we have a copy of Enemy Controller. This was not in everyone's deck. It was in a few decks. I love Enemy Controller in decks that have Treeborn Frog. I also like, in this particular format, having quick plays, because the way Light and Darkness Dragon works, if you're unfamiliar, which is something that you definitely need to know if you go back and play formats with this card will stop Chainlink 1. So, for example, if you activate MST, its effect will trigger, negating MST, but Chainlink 2 and beyond get to resolve fully. Light and Darkness Dragon cannot be used again in that chain. So if you go Chainlink 2 Enemy Controller, you can take control of their Light and Darkness Dragon and maybe tribute it off so they don't get the revival effect. You can activate Enemy Controller to shift it to defense, and maybe that's enough for you to attack over it. It gives you some flexibility there with a card that's pretty reasonable Chainlink 2 or higher that can actually deal with Light and Darkness Dragon. Same is true with Wing Blast. Wing Blast was one of the better outs to Light and Darkness Dragon, because you'd activate something and then chain Wing Blast as Chainlink 2 and spin their Light and Darkness Dragon to the top of their deck, and now they don't get the revival effects, and Light and Darkness Dragon can be a pretty bad draw on that following turn, right? They invested 2 tributes and they're not getting that recursion effect. So I think Enemy Control is a pretty reasonable inclusion as an out to Light and Darkness Dragon. It's just always a pretty good card when you're running Treeborn Frog, right? You can tribute off the Treeborn Frog standby phase, bring back the Treeborn Frog. Now you can double tribute for your own Light and Darkness Dragon. You can tribute the monster that you took for a Monarch, right? You don't even necessarily have to have Light and Darkness Dragon. It, in and of itself, can swing the game out of nowhere, right? You chain it to Wing Blast, tributing the monster that they targeted. You take control of one of theirs. Obviously, Enemy Controller is just one of the most flexible cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. I think it slots in really well in this particular format. The last card, and this was a prize card, and there weren't many of them. So if you want to go back and not include Gold Sarcophagus, I would totally understand it. Technically, if you had access to it, you would probably run it. You could banish Crush Card Virus and wait 2 turns, as Gold Sarcophagus is intended to do, and then get access to the most powerful trap in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. They are both prize cards at the time, so I can totally understand if you see this and say, no, I'm just going to play 2 Foolish Burials. I don't want to mess around with prize cards. I wouldn't have been able to afford them, therefore I'm not going to include them in my retro decks. However, I do typically like to include the prize cards just to show you what the ceiling was with some of these decks. But Gold Sark was a prize card, very expensive card. If you want to go back and play it, Gold Sark itself is not as game-breaking as Crush Card. We've had that conversation before. You can make that decision, but I am going to include it just for the sake of showing what the absolute ceiling was in these decks. For the Trop lineup, we have 2 copies of Wing Blast. This is a fantastic card in Perfect Circle-based decks. In addition to combining really well with D-Rada, it's also one of the outs to Light and Darkness Dragon, as I commented on earlier. As you can see, so much of your deck building had to consider the existence of Light and Darkness Dragon, from including Reaper and Marshmallow, to me including Enemy Controller, to obviously having these in your deck, having Soul Exchange in your deck. So absolutely, we have 1 copy of Trap Dust Shoot, which was limited to 1, but just such a power card. I think you absolutely go and include it. Call the Haunted, it in and of itself might not necessarily be the best card using retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Or using modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Perspective, but we're playing Disc Commander, we're playing Sangin, we're playing Card Trooper. Absolutely run it, no doubt. We have Torrential Tribute and Mirror Force, which is being cut in a lot of decks if you go back and use modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Perspective, but I think they're fairly valuable in this format. You can do Chain Links with Torrential Tribute to get rid of Light and Darkness Dragon, right? If you're able to use Torrential as Chain Link 2. Mirror Force, you also can do that, right? When you go MST, Chain Mirror Force, that can get rid of Light and Darkness Dragon. Some of those might not necessarily be the best exchanges, depending on what they're recurring off Light and Darkness Dragon, because instead of bouncing it to the top, you're actually destroying it. So it kind of depends on exactly where the game is, but both of these mass removal cards were basically staples, even in some of the anti-meta decks that I've been commenting on, like Macrocosmos, so we are going to include them. And then the last card is, of course, Crush Card Virus. It was a prize card. It was incredibly expensive. Again, I've been showing you the decks at their absolute ceiling. You play Crush Card if you have access to it. This deck has a ton of targets from Sangin, Malicious, Disc, Fearmonger, Reaper. You absolutely run it. If you want to cut Crush Card Virus because you wouldn't have been able to afford it, you could incorporate Pulling the Rug into the trap lineup. That might seem a little bit awkward and a weird recommendation, but Pulling the Rug was actually a main deckable card at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Almost every deck used a normal summon that triggered an effect. From this deck with the Monarchs and Stratos, there was a Macrocosmos-based deck that had actually Stratos plus Wildheart, so you could at least hit that single copy of Stratos. The gadgets all get hit by Pulling the Rug. Demise was sort of a fringe OTK rogue deck. It hits all of the searchers in that deck. It actually had some application. Hits Volcanic Rocket, which was a deck that you could worry about. So I know Pulling the Rug might seem like an unusual inclusion in the main deck, but that was a card that if you go back and look, a lot of people actually included. But if you want to cut Crush Card, there's a lot of options. You could do the trade-in Plasma version of this deck. That would also require you to play Scapegoat. So you can manipulate the deck if you don't want to play with the prize cards. They are obviously a very powerful card that can swing the game just by their single activation, especially if it's Crush Card Virus. So that's a decision you can make. I'm always going to profile these decks, though, at their ceiling. So what are we expecting to play against? Well, there's still the Card of Safe Return Zombie deck. We profiled that not too long ago, but the sort of the Super Friends Canadian Zombie Master based deck with Card of Safe Return, really awesome deck. There was, of course, the Mirror Match. Now, in addition to just the Mirror Match, as you just saw in the profile with Light and Darkness Dragon, there were still some holdovers of people who just never played Light and Darkness Dragon, instead played Zaborg and had success. I like Light and Darkness Dragon. It's not only a really fun card when it gets to do its whole thing in Revive Disc Commander, I just think it is a really powerful card, so I would prefer Light and Darkness Dragon. There were people, though, that just never put it in their decks. They played very similar to Labani's Perfect Circle deck from the beginning of the format and stuck with Zaborg. So I'm going to put Zaborg there to represent that decision. There's, of course, Comic Odyssey Burn, something we very recently profiled with Skill Drain. Gadget's really popular, right? There were limitations to a bunch of their 1-for-1 removal cards, but there were multiple Gadget decks, 4 Gadget decks in the top 16 of the Shonen Jump where this deck won. Cedric won with D-Rada. So Gadget's a fantastic anti-meta deck. Even with all of the Gadgets limited to 2, you could still very easily jam your deck with a bunch of anti-meta trap cards and still easily win the game. Then, of course, you had this deck's worst matchup. I hated playing against this deck, which is the DD Survivor, D-Fissure macro deck. You could run both of these in 3. You could play 3 Dark Bribes. You could play 3 Solemn Judgments. It was such a difficult matchup. It's a deck I plan on profiling in the near future, and it was just a nightmare matchup because yes, you do have outs to these, but they have more counters between 3 Dark Bribes and 3 Solemn Judgments than you have outs to these, and it's really difficult for you to function with these on the field for obvious reasons, right? Your Malicious not working, Disc Commander's not working, Light and Darkness Dragon's not recurring anything, so it's just a giant 2800 that's not all that great. Your ability to Tribute Summon for Rise is limited. It's one of the reasons why I have Spy in the main deck, because it at least slows the game down against DD Survivor. It sort of depends on what they've decided to incorporate with Survivor. Did they play Monarchs themselves, in which case Rise is not quite as good? Or do they stick low to the ground and play cards like Banisher, DD Survivor, maybe something like Wildheart / Stratos, in which case Spy is actually fantastic. So I've elected to run Spy. In many ways, it was because of this deck and actually a little bit of the Gadget deck too. Some anti-meta cards in the main deck is why Spy is there. But we definitely had to take that into consideration. A deck I plan on profiling in the very near future is Baboon Burn. If you play GOAT format, you're probably aware of the synergy between Panda, Just Desserts, Ojama Trio specifically, maybe even Secret Barrel. There was a version of that exact deck during this format, but it got to play Green Baboon before Green Baboon was errated or the way in which it worked changed. At this point in time, when Green Baboon died during the battle phase, during specifically by battle, or a beast was destroyed by battle, you could pay the 1,000 to recur it from the graveyard. That's not how it functions anymore, but it basically meant as long as Green Baboon is in the graveyard, anytime any of your beasts died by battle, you could just recur this giant beat stick. And with 3 Foolish Burials, you could actually reliably send that single copy of Baboon to the graveyard or just naturally draw it. So that Baboon Burn deck was really powerful because it took advantage of the synergies between Ojama Trio, Just Desserts, and all of those, but it also took advantage of the fact that they're all beasts, right? Panda's a beast, Esquala's a beast. The deck was filled with beast monsters. Giant Rat is a beast that functioned really well with Panda. And there was sort of on the fringes a Demise deck that topped at the very end of this format, so I definitely should point that out. A lot of limitations to some of their combo pieces, like Metamorphosis is long banned at this point, but Swing of Memories was a new card that could actually recur the giant 2800 normal monster that it could be used with Advanced Ritual Art. So you actually did have a way of OTKing by, instead of using cards like Metamorphosis, you use Swing of Memories and end up recurring this giant 2800 beat stick, which functions very similar to what the original OTK was trying to do. But these are just some of the decks at the time that you could anticipate playing against. So for me, I think if you play D-Hero against D-Hero, there's really no major point in siding all that much. I think the D-Hero deck against the D-Hero deck is a pretty reasonably fair game. I don't really think there's a lot of matchup breakers per se, especially if you're already main decking DD Crow. So my side deck is really based for all of the other matchups. I really don't care about the mirror match. So when you play against the trap heavy decks, especially the macro decks and also the skill drain decks, to a certain extent the Panda decks, because they do actually include some of the stall cards like Level Limit in their deck, I think siding in Mobius is really important. And siding a Light and Darkness Dragon is probably the decision that needs to be made. You just don't have the reliable way of getting 2 monsters on the field, especially when your opponent has D-Fissure, to actually summon Light and Darkness Dragon. And the same can be said about some of the other matchups as well. So double Mobius, switch those in. Now all of a sudden you have cards that obviously you can deal with Defissure and Macro, right? In a perfect world, you set Spy, your opponent sets some of their Defissure or Macro, and then you tribute summon from Mobius on the next turn, and now you can destroy that without ever having to worry about anything going to the graveyard, right? Malicious, Treeborn Frog, none of those went to the graveyard. So double Mobius, a fantastic counter to those. Double Cyber Dragon allows us to attack over. DD Survivor allows us to attack over a lot of the gadgets. This is before Chimera Tech, so the synergy of a machine versus gadget isn't going to be there. But it does allow you to attack over most of their beat stick monsters. And it gives you a way of special summoning and then summoning a Mobius right after, or a Ryza if you absolutely need to, and trying to get rid of some of those back rows. So double Cyber Dragon. Then we have 2 legendary Jujutsu Masters, right? The big defense 18 walls basically the entire DD Survivor base deck, assuming they're not including Monarchs themselves. And again, you're just trying to slow things down against those decks and try and draw into some of your back row removal. And it's also pretty good against the gadget deck. Anytime your opponent runs a gadget into this, they're obviously now going to draw a pretty dead card off the top of gadget, seeing as how they probably have one in hand. Now they have to deal with this, right? If they play Smashing Ground, it doesn't really feel that advantageous. Hammer Shot doesn't deal with this in defense mode, something that's interesting to note, right? Because of the limitations to Fissure and Smashing Ground, the gadget player actually included cards like Hammer Shot, so it's actually a pretty fantastic out. When we combine double Jujutsu, double Spy, I like that defense against some of these stun-based strategies. 2 copies of Kinetic Soldier, which again was for the DD Survivor base deck, especially the version that played Wildheart and Stratos. Those usually played Exiled Force too, so they would have outs to this. But the 1800 defense walls against this deck, and then the effect boosts it way beyond all of these. So you can actually kind of steal a game against this deck, where they attack into this, they take a bunch of damage because this gets boosted all the way up to a 3800 with the defense points, and now they take 2000 just by that attack, and then you switch it to attack, and you attack over the DD Survivor and deal a bunch of more damage. So if they played Solemn Judgment early in the game, they could totally lose out of nowhere just because they had no outs to Kinetic Soldier. So double Kinetic Soldier. It wasn't overwhelmingly popular, which is why I don't have it included here, but the early versions of Six Samurais were out too. I'm not talking about with modern day Shien and the tuners, right? We are way before the time of tuners, but I'm talking about, you know, the original Six Samurai, and this card obviously is fantastic against the original Six Samurai. Then we have triple Dust Tornado. I am super afraid of Wave Motion Cannon, Skill Drains, Defissures, Macro, Floodgate / Trap cards out of the Gadget deck, and then cards that stop battle like Gravity Bind and Level Limit out of the Panda deck. So I am going full-blown triple Dust Tornado. I'm not messing around. I want to have as many outs to back rows as possible. This card's also really good against Card of Safe Return if you're afraid about being snowballed by that deck. That also goes along with 2 copies of Royal Decree. So we are going hardcore to try and counteract some of our worst matchups. As you can see, I have no considerations here for the mirror match beside the 2 cards that are in my hand, and going hardcore against those really, really tough matchups, right? I mean, you do not want to play against Macro with a D-Hero based deck like this. So you need to have a ton of cards in the side deck because you're probably going to lose game 1. The last card, though, is Pulling the Rug. You could put Pulling the Rug in against D-Heroes. It hits Ryza, it hits Breaker, hits Stratos, which might not necessarily warrant a spot, but is something that you can consider. If they're playing the Zaborg over Light and Darkness Dragon version, then you definitely want to include it because there's way more targets now, right? Light and Darkness Dragon doesn't get affected by Pulling the Rug, whereas Zaborg would. But this actually stops the Senju and the Sonic Bird and the Manju out of Demise. It stops all of the gadgets, so it has some functionality there, which means it's a pretty reasonable card. If your opponent's playing the Monarch version of the macro-based decks, you could consider putting it in against DD Survivor decks too, right? If they're playing a bunch of Monarchs, which sometimes people did, it's useful there. Otherwise, it's just going to hit, Stratos out of that version of the deck, which isn't that great. But as a whole, if you, take a look at our side deck, it really is entirely based on just counteracting our worst matchups and saying to the top deck at the time, the deck that everybody considered the boogeyman, which is the mirror match, and just say, let's just play straight up, right? Let's not really go out of our way to side deck a lot. Maybe we'll throw in Pulling the Rugs, and let's just play D-Hero against D-Hero and see what happens, which is actually something that you see in a lot of D-Hero based decks, counteracting the tough matchups in the side, and kind of just playing straight up game 1 and 2, 3. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.